When we look at the beginning of Matthew's gospel account of the story of Jesus, as we did during Advent in December, we see that Matthew takes great lengths for us to see and understand that Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, is the son of David, that he is from the line and lineage of David, that he inherits the kingship of David through his family line. But it's not just important that if Jesus were to go on Ancestry.com today, he would find out that David was his ancestor. It's also important that he is a new and better David, that he does what David could not do, that the promises to David are fulfilled in him. When we look to Psalm 16, we actually find a better way of reading our Bibles. You know, I remember talking to skeptical people, and sometimes they'll admit the Bible is a useful historical document. It's a book that teaches us history. I know others. I remember growing up in church and sometimes hearing that, the Bible is the Bible, basic instructions before life ends, as if it was just a list of rules that you had to do to get to heaven. Now, that's not to say there isn't some truth to that, but it's not the whole story. We don't just do a list of things in order to get to heaven. That's actually missing the point very much, I think. There's a better way of reading our Bibles. It's not just a book about the historical figures, David or Abraham or Noah. It's not a book of fables, just stories of how you are to live. Oh, well, we see David did this and that's good, let's do it. As if you're supposed to read the story of David and go, I should go be a shepherd and play a harp for fun. Or I should go and try to slay some giants. Or I should go commit adultery and then have the husband murdered. Obviously, you can get off the rails pretty quickly if you try to make the Bible just mere fables that you're supposed to follow. There's a better way of reading our Bibles. There is a way in which we see that the Bible is written ultimately through his inspiration by God. God is the author. He's also the protagonist. He's the main character. When we read our Bibles, it's not simply so we can understand history, not merely so that we can just understand what we're supposed to do with our lives, but it's so we can understand who God is and what he has done. That's how we read our Bibles. And as we read Psalm 16, we see exactly that. So what we're going to do this morning, in order to understand what this psalm is all about, is we're going to look at it in two parts. The first will be verses 1 through 6, where we get a picture of a devoted life to God. And then we're going to read verses 7 through 11, where we see the example of God's blessings to one who is devoted to him. But we're not going to stop there. We're not just going to look at David and what he said. We're not just going to look on how that changes how we live. But we're going to end in the most appropriate place, which is to see that this psalm, as the whole Bible does, leads us to and points us to Jesus, so that the picture we get is one in which Jesus is the main character. So we begin with verse 1. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. See, in these two verses, we see that a devoted life depends on God. A devoted life recognizes that in difficult situations, the only one who can preserve us, the only one in which we can find our refuge and our safety is God. And that's what I think David is experiencing. I don't know if you've ever read the Psalms just throughout the book. There's 150 of them. There's quite a few, I know. But many of them are ascribed to David, and this guy must have felt like he was constantly in trouble. Because there are so many Psalms in which he is like at the point of thinking he's going to die, and then cries out to the God for deliverance. And most of the time it came. So here we have him crying out, knowing that his place to go when times are difficult is God. The one he needs to depend on is God. But not only that, he says to the Lord, to Yahweh, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one true living God, you are my Lord. He recognizes that the Lord is his master. He is his king. He is the one to whom he's going to subject himself to. And why? He says, I have no good apart from you. I have no good apart from you. This is something we've lost in our culture, which is there is goodness, truth, and beauty. There are these transcendental ideas that go beyond ourselves, that there is goodness and truth and beauty beyond everything we see in our daily life. And because those things exist, we can actually live this life and see those things in the world. We can see shadows of the goodness of God. We can see shadows of his truth and his beauty. The medieval Christians would use those three ideas and say, well, how we know what goodness is by knowing God, for he is good. How do we know what truth is? We look to God. He is truth. How do we know what beauty is? We look to God, for he is beauty itself. David says, I have no good apart from you. I can do no good apart from you. I can possess no good apart from you. True goodness comes only from God. And we can try to make up goodness for ourselves. We can try to make a beautiful life for ourselves. We can try to find our own truth, but it will fall short. Why? Because I have no good, I have no truth, I have no beauty apart from you. You are my Lord. You know, and some people don't like the idea of God being a master or him being in charge. These people tend to be a certain kind of personality. They want to be in charge. They want to decide for themselves. But the reality is, I'll quote my favorite theologian, I say in jest, Bob Dylan. As he's saying, you're going to serve somebody. You've got to serve somebody. He said it might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you've got to serve somebody. We all have masters. Some of us just don't realize it. Some of us have been mastered by God. Some of us have been mastered by a certain sin that just hangs over us, even if we don't recognize that it is a sin. Some of us have been mastered by overbearing parents. Some of us have been mastered by pop stars. Don't get me started on how important Taylor Swift is to the Kansas City Chiefs. Don't get Cody started. His world is just great right now because he loves Taylor Swift and he loves the Chiefs, and she won the Super Bowl and he's just ecstatic. We all make masters out of something. The question is, are we going to acknowledge that the true master, the true Lord, Yahweh, is the only one, the only master who's in it for you, who has your best interest at heart, who wants to see you live into a better reality, who wants you to have a life that is meaningful and a death that is meaningful and a life with him forever. None of those other things are going to get you that. So David starts in the right place. And it turns out when you start in the right place, you usually end up in the right place. So David starts with his relationship to God. But in verse 3, that changes his relationship to the other people. He says, as for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. See, a devoted life, a life devoted to God, delights in the saints. It delights in the holy ones. It delights in those who are trusting in the Lord. And it's not a matter of them being virtuous. You know, again, I mentioned it was St. Patrick's Day. He's a capital S saint, an ST dot saint. But we're not bearing saint as a title. It's a description of what God has done for us, not how good we are, not how many healings we can attribute to our life, but how much God has healed us from our sin, how much God has healed us from our brokenness. And those people who have been healed by God, who are saints, who are Christians, if we are one of them, if we are devoted to God, we will actually delight in them. And you're all sitting there thinking, yeah, right. I've been in church for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. When have I ever really delighted in the saints? When have I really ever gone to church for other people? Now, I don't think ultimately we go to church for other people. We go to church for God and to foster our relationship to him. But secondarily, I do think we go to church for other people. Listen, if you are here this morning, your presence is a blessing to the people around you. And you may not believe that. You may not really think it is. But it is an encouragement to the people around you that they're not the only ones who aren't fishing this morning. They're not the only ones who are skipping sleeping in this morning, had to wake up and get to church. They're not the only ones who, in a world that says, enjoy, max out your credit card, have a good time, they're encouraged that they're not the only ones who say, I'm going to give some time on a Sunday morning, actually enough time that I'm going to miss half of my Sunday, which is like a quarter of my weekend, to God. It's an encouragement that you're here. It encourages me and encourages the people around you. And we should come and delight in the saints, to have that fellowship that is described in the book of Acts chapter 2. So a devoted life delights in the saints. Now, the devoted life doesn't delight in everything. In verse 4, it says, the sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. He's describing the idolatry that is occurring even in the land, even among some of the Jewish people. There is idolatry. I was talking to Mike this morning about how our culture, as it becomes more secular, doesn't become more enlightened and doesn't get beyond fables. It doesn't get beyond myths or anything like that. It actually becomes more pagan. As our culture is secularizing, it becomes more pagan. If you think our culture does not have blood offerings, now in one sense, in a literal sense, but in another sense, then you're just wrong. You're not paying attention. If you don't see that our culture has people who are worshiping plenty of other things than God, you're just not paying attention. And it may be the case for you that in your life right now, what you spend your time and energy and money on reveal that your God is not Jesus Christ, but your God is one of your own making or one that the world has thrown in your lap and you're just continuing to feed it. So the devoted life hates idolatry. Hates idolatry with a passion. I say it's not nice to hate, but when you're hating evil things, when you're hating the worship of one other than God, that's a good thing. Now in verses 5 and 6, we finally see that a devoted life accepts the lot God gives it. It says, the Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. Instead of taking the drink offerings of blood and the name of the false gods, instead the Lord is my chosen portion and my cup, is what David says. He says, you hold my lot. Now casting lots was a way of kind of leaving things to chance or to fate. But here David says, well, nothing's to chance or to fate. God holds my lot. In verse 6, the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. Now, I think what's going on here is the lines are kind of the property lines of the land that David is dwelling in. The lines have fallen for him in pleasant places, which some of you orderly, neat people, you know who you are, and probably everyone around you knows who they are. Janice, you can stop looking around for people to be looking at you. It's not just talking about a neat, orderly life where everything is tidy and pleasant, although that might be nice. But it's talking about accepting where God has placed you. There's a contentment with the devoted life. Now, David happened to be a king. But in his day and age, I'll tell you what he didn't have that you do. Indoor plumbing. He didn't have a TV or a cell phone. He didn't have a car. So yes, he was a king, and you might say, well, I'm not a king. I don't live as good as David. He can be content all he wants. Trust me, you have far more than David ever could have imagined. I mean, just truthfully, this is just a historical fact. So we see that the devoted life is lived by David and is given to us is one that depends on God, delights in the saints, hates idolatry, and accepts its lot in life. But listen to this. What blessings come from this kind of life? Well, we see God's blessings in verses 7 through 11. We see his guidance. In verse 7, it says, I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night, also my heart instructs me. Wouldn't you love to have God as your counselor? To give you advice, to help you figure out what you're supposed to do? I've heard it and I've said it myself. I just wish God would verbally tell me exactly what to do. But you know what we have? that generations of devoted believers didn't have, what David, when he wrote this psalm, didn't have. We have this book. And again, it's actually 66 books, and it's telling one unified story that points to Jesus. But throughout it all, we have the counsel of the Lord. We see who he is, we see what his character is, we see how he acts, we see what he does, and we see what he wants for us. And it's not a list of rules so that we can come hang out with him. It's just a way that we live when we're in his presence. And so we can receive counsel from the Lord. I think the blessing we have is this book. And you've probably been learning lots about this book if you've been coming on Sunday afternoons to Cody's class, which I think is ending today, right? God blesses us with his guidance. Look in verse 8. It goes on, I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. It's kind of like an interesting image. I set God always before me, but he's at my right hand. I mean, we can't limit God to one place. But he's saying, I set him before me. He is the goal that I am striving for. He is the one in whom I am following. I have nothing else worth following after than God himself. Nothing else will satisfy. Nothing else is going to do it. But not only that, but as he is the one I am striving for, as he is the one I am following, he is at my right hand. That the imagery of the right hand is like your right-hand man. It actually makes me think of the president and the chief of staff. And the president is this figurehead, he gives all the speeches, he says all the stuff. But you know, if you know anything about how the White House works, the chief of staff is controlling a lot of things, right? He controls the schedule of the president. He controls who gets to come see him and who doesn't. He controls what the president reads and what he says and all those things. He's very involved. He is guiding the president, trying to bring him success, but guiding him. There is a sense in which, although the Lord is the one that David is following, there is a sense in which he will not be shaken, he will not be overtaken by this world, because his right-hand man is also God. And the kind of humility that it takes God to put himself in that position in someone's life, in the life of one of his creatures, is amazing. That God would humble himself to be the one trying to bring about your good. God blesses with his guidance, but also with his faithfulness. Look in verses 9 and 10. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. Now we're going to come back to this verse. But just to look at it for a moment, we see his faithfulness. That David is in a place where he sees that the enemies are surrounding him, death is on its way, but he says, no, my flesh dwells secure. My whole being rejoices in this moment, because I know that you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. You will not let me die here. You will not let me see corruption. And then finally, God blesses with his exaltation. In verse 11, after going through this, David says, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Catch this image again. The Lord is always before me. He is at my right hand, but now David says, I am at his right hand. And there are pleasures forevermore. I'm at the honored seat at the table. I get to contribute to the mission. But we need to dig a little deeper. This isn't just a psalm, as I said at the beginning, that teaches us mere history about David. It's not a psalm that just teaches us how we are to live, like a fable. It's a psalm that teaches us about God. It teaches us about Jesus Christ. When the early Christians read this psalm, they thought that David was prophesying about Jesus. In Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches to a bunch of people who are not saved at that moment, a bunch of people who are about to be. And what he tells them is this psalm can't be completely about David. It can't be true right now. He said, we're in Jerusalem. You know what happened to David? He died. You know what happened to David? His body is in a grave, and it's decayed. It saw corruption. He said his tomb is still with us today. He's saying if you wanted to go, I'm guessing he wasn't recommending this. He said if you want to go dig him up, you will see that he is not alive. His body is corrupted, it is decayed, it is probably just a bunch of bones in a vase. And his soul is where? In Sheol. Sheol is the Jewish word for the underworld, the afterlife, this disembodied existence before the resurrection. Peter's point is this: if this psalm is just about David, it's not true right now. If this psalm is true, it cannot be about David. He said that David, as a prophet, spoke of Jesus who was to come. This is in Acts chapter 2. And Paul does the same thing, bringing up the same verse, verse 10, in Acts chapter 13 when he's preaching, as it's recorded there. This verse, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." They say it's got to be about Jesus. Because Jesus, on a Friday, was hanged on a cross. He was pierced to quicken his death, and he died that horrific death. Now on Saturday, they had taken his body down on Friday, before the Friday evening began. And they put him in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. He didn't even have a family tomb. They just put him in someone else's tomb. And what they were going to do with his body, this is just a little bit of Jewish burial practice. They're going to take his body and lay it out. And over the course of some time, they would come and anoint his body so that it would decay properly. And then at the end of all that, he'd be left with his bones. And because they believed in the future resurrection of the dead, they would have taken his bones, once he was just bones, and placed it probably in a burial vase of some kind, and then stored it. The exact same thing that happened to David. His body was laid out, it was anointed and perfumed and decayed, and they took what remained, all these bones, and put it and stored it. So on Saturday, I'm sure his mother, who saw him on the cross, was still weeping. His friends probably too, especially his friends who saw him not just as a brother, but maybe as a father figure, as a teacher, as a rabbi. Can you imagine how scared they were, how shocked they were? They thought this guy was going to come and defeat Rome and establish God's kingdom on earth, but instead he was hanged and died on a Roman cross. I mean, a complete failure. All their hope gone. I mean, these guys abandoned their jobs. They left their families for extended periods of time to follow this guy. And on Saturday, he was dead. On Saturday, his soul was in Sheol, and his body lay to decay in a tomb he didn't even own. And then on Sunday, a group of his followers, some of the women, came to the tomb to anoint his body, to perfume it, so that, again, it would decay the proper way, so that eventually they'd take his bones and put them in a vase and be done with it. And when they showed up, his body was not there. When they showed up, his body was not there. They weren't at the wrong tomb. It was empty. His body wasn't stolen. It wasn't there. They were told that he had been raised from the dead. Now, this is a shock to us in our culture, but to them it would have been a real shock, because they were expecting the resurrection to happen only when God was going to raise all of Israel. But here, only one, the one who claimed to be Messiah, the one they thought was the Christ, had been raised from the dead. His soul was not abandoned to Sheol because it was no longer there. His body did not see corruption. On the third day, it was raised and glorified. In verse 11, imagining Jesus after having gone through Saturday, having gone through, in some sense, hell, Sheol, having gone through all that and being raised from the dead, hear these words: "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." We know that Jesus appeared to his disciples and to many, and eventually ascended to the right hand of the Father, where he rules and reigns now, especially through his church, and from where he will come again. When the early Christians read this, they said it can't be true of David. Maybe in that moment when he wrote it, it was true, but it's not true now. David has decayed like we thought Jesus was going to. But instead, Jesus was raised from the dead. And we can devote our lives to God like David did and receive God's blessings because Jesus was devoted to God and received God's blessings. It is because Jesus did verses 1 through 6 that he was given 7 through 11. And because Jesus was given it, so can you. And his call on your life right now is something that no one else would say because he's telling you to come and die. Jesus is calling you to come and die, to die to yourselves, to die to your sins, to die to all the masters that you've made for yourself, to come and die so that you might live, so that you might live today, that you might truly live, that you might live in this life in a way that you could not imagine living before. To live forever, a life that never ends. But how? By dying. Jesus died on the cross so that he could live an exalted and glorified life, so that he could be the down payment on the resurrection you will receive one day. Jesus died, and he's calling you now to go with him, to die today, so that you might live spiritually a resurrected life, and one day, physically a resurrected life. Jesus is calling you to die. He said he was the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to God the Father except through him. No one comes to God the Father except through this man. You must do business with this man. He died so that you might die. He was raised from the dead so that you might be raised from the dead, both a spiritual death today and a physical death in the future. Die to yourself, die to your sin, and trust this man. Let's pray.